Well, good afternoon, everyone. Well, we're really blessed at the festival because we have the wonderful Helen Macdonald here to talk to us this afternoon. Yeah.
Thank you for coming at the 3 o'clock sort of lull in the day. It's extremely lovely that you are all here.
So, as well, we'll talk about everything, but we all know about H is for Hawk. I'm sure you've all read it. It was the most sort of wondrous of arrival in I think in nature literature, if that's the right way to put it. And Helen has brought out a collection of her writings, mainly for the New York Times, but not exclusively, called Vesper Flights. And it's an incredibly thoughtful and moving collection of essays, I think, for want of a better expression, which range from animals, birds, nests, all kinds of aperçus about the natural world. And I'm going to ask Helen all about it.
I'm here. Grill me. Grill me.
I'm intrigued to start off with, actually, by the fact that H is for Hawk, in a way, began with you processing grief. And in here, one of the things that popped up about your childhood was that perhaps your search and interest in nature was about the solitude that you suffered from the loss of your twin brother at birth, so that you sort of shared the womb, then
I did.
Have experienced loss thereafter.
It was a very strange experience, this, yes. From very early on, I was always searching. I sound like a sort of Californian self-help book, don't I? But I was always searching for something that I knew was there or was missing. I didn't find out until I was 18 that there was a twin brother. The whole circumstances of his loss were so traumatic, my parents just didn't talk about it. And as soon as I found out, I'm like, oh, okay, yeah, that's quite a good heuristic for understanding why, as a child, I would compulsively seek out life. You know, I would go out and turn over rocks, which was always fun on holidays with the parents in Greece, as I used to bring back scorpions and small snakes to show them. But this sort of hunger for contact with things that were not me, and particularly with falconry too, the sense that with falconry, obviously you have a completely wild creature that you bond with, and then you set free. Every time you fly it, it's free, and then it comes back, and that coming back is I don't want to reduce everything to psychology, but it's a very strong emotional moment every time. So yeah, I think there is certainly a way of reading my kind of slightly quirky natural historian brain that relates to that early loss, yeah.
And then as a child, you moved to this extraordinary piece of land.
Yes.
Which was run by the Theosophists.
Yes, the Theosophists.
And you got to sort of play in this incredible playground, really, with extraordinary people.
Yes, it was the kind of childhood that at the time, of course, as a child, you just think everyone has normal childhoods, and I thought it was normal. Yeah, my parents were both hard-bitten journalists, and they bought a house on a sort of weird little country estate in the middle of Camberley, which at that time was turning from sort of officer land to yuppie land. And it was owned by the Theosophical Society, which was this great 19th century esoteric spiritual society, and it was amazing. The whole place was full of very elderly ladies from very good families who had gone a bit weird. And there were sort of refugees from Germany, there were sort of concert pianists, there were a lot of affairs between various people. There was a man who used to send his beard cuttings back from Nepal to be burned on the bonfire. And there was one man also who said to me, you went to Cambridge, where did you stable your horse? I had terrible trouble when I was there in the 30s. So they were really deeply eccentric. And I think my favourite one was when I went to Bird World in Farnham and I saw my first flamingos. I saw 3 flamingos in a concrete puddle. I was like, oh my God. And I came back, and Kate Batty Smith, who lived across the road, came over, and I told her, Miss Batty Smith, I saw the flamingos. And she went, oh, darling, aren't they marvellous? The whole sky goes pink. I was like, what? So they all had this really amazing, and I love them now because, I was wandering around, catching snakes and climbing trees and basically going feral. But these mostly elderly women really taught me that I didn't have to really play by the rules when it came to life. I could kind of be who I wanted, and I'm always going to be, really thankful for them for that.
Yeah, extraordinary playground. And you bring the sort of bits of scrub, all kinds of bits of landscape to life in the most extraordinary way. Were you remotely conscious of what was going on? That
I'm still not remotely conscious of what's going on. But you mean in terms of what was happening in terms of turning me into a naturalist kind of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. I think that, one of the lessons it really taught me as a child was, when you're a child, the scale of your life is deeply human, in that, you have rooms and you have playing fields and you have schoolrooms, and that's kind of this sort of the size of your life. It's very, very, everyday and constrained. And then I would go into the meadow, and I would sort of do weird stuff like lie with my face pressed into the grass, and I would see kind of thrips and springtails and tiny insects clambering around on grass stems. And then I would look at the sky and see kind of, swifts flying over at, thousands of feet and these giant cumuluses. And I suddenly had these intimations of how the world was not just one world, but many, many worlds. And that the human scale is only just one way of approaching it. And I think that was a really big moment for me. A bit like discovering, bird migration and how that works, or, the sense that, and I think that's the wonder at the heart of my relationship to nature, I think, is just that sense that the joy of realizing that the world isn't just for us. It's millions of worlds inhabited by millions of different organisms, and it's just thrilling.
And you say in your introduction, it's one thing to show the statistical facts about species decline, but it's another to communicate to people what wood warblers are and what the loss means when your experience of a wood that is made of light and leaves and song becomes something less complex, less magical, just less once the warblers have gone. Literature can teach us the qualitative texture of the world, and we need it to. We need to communicate the value of things so that more of us might fight to save them.
Yeah.
And that's what made you a writer?
What made me a writer was, I think, initially just the look at this. Look at this thing, isn't it incredible? Just that genuine sort of sense of wanting to just... I'm the obnoxious person on a walk who was always pointing out spiders and plants and things. That's kind of how it started. But then, realizing slowly that we're living through the sixth great extinction and it's happening all around us, those kind of pointings out become a kind of witnessing, a kind of desperate urgency to them. And yeah, I just want to, I want in my writing to, sorry, I'm sort of going off on one, but it's just it's such an important thing. If you feel hopeless about the way the world's going, you do nothing because there's no point. If you feel optimistic, you do nothing because you don't think there's anything to be done. Living in between those two spaces, I think, pointing out what's still there and what's still astonishing is a really valuable thing to try and do, and that's what I try and do in the book.
And when did the naturalist in you first become aware of the precariousness of the situation for nature?
Oh, I mean, I was born in 1970, and rather terrifying is since 1970, the collapse in the world's ecosystems and biodiversity has just been precipitous. So, from the very beginning, I was sort of born, and my early kind of understanding of nature was around kind of Earth Day and the original kind of Save the Whales. So there was always a sense that it was threatened, but what wasn't threatened back then was the everyday.
Yeah.
I would expect that the entire garden would be full of wasps, and that that when you drove, that moths would be all over the car. I expected plenitude, and I expected nature to be everywhere. And I think the first thing I noticed that really gave me pause was as a teenager when I realized I hadn't seen a flock of lapwings for many years.
Well,
and then that was the moment I thought, okay, things are really going wrong. And I'm really interested now that you have, driving here, I saw sort of, 50 buzzards and 1 million red kites, and, that there's sort of really visible big raptors that are everywhere now. And it's still lovely to see them, but I always sort of feel like, that they are masking the terrible loss of, insect life, reptile life, farmland bird life. We have these great success stories, but underneath everything's sort of vanishing, and it's hard. It's hard to keep sort of optimistic and keep going with that happening.
But it struck me how you had an extraordinary sense as a child of the world, and can you do a little passage?
Oh yes, I'm doing something terrible to this. I'm so sorry. I will try and stop moving. Yes, a psychologically open part here. I just to say, when I read Ages for Hawk, initially I tried to be much more British about it. I thought people are going to be really interested in the hawk, not me, or grief, like whatever. And I started writing, and it just didn't go anywhere. And I realized suddenly, this moment, that I had to be really open and tell everyone like the actual thing that was going on emotionally with me. And as soon as I realized that, the book began to flow. So readers know when you're not telling the truth. So I try to be really open, and sometimes it's excruciating. Anyway, often during stressful times when I was small, while changing schools, when bullied, or after my parents had argued, which they did, I'd lie in bed before I fell asleep and count in my head all the different layers between me and the center of the earth: crust, upper mantle, lower mantle, outer core, inner core. Then I'd think upwards in expanding rings of thinning air: troposphere, stratosphere, mesosphere, thermosphere, exosphere. A few miles beneath me was molten rock, a few miles above, limitless dust and vacancy, and there I'd lie with the warm blanket of the troposphere over me, and a red cotton duvet too, and the smell of tonight's dinner lingering upstairs, and downstairs, the sound of my mother busy at her typewriter. This evening ritual wasn't a test of how much I could keep in my mind at once, or of how far I could send my imagination. It had something of the power of incantation, but it did not seem a compulsion, and it was not a prayer. No matter how tightly the day's bad things had gripped me, there was so much up there above me, so much below, so many places and states that were implacable, unreachable, entirely uninterested in human affairs. Listing them one by one built imaginative sanctuary between walls of unknowing knowns, and it helped in other ways too. Sleeping was like losing time, somehow like not being alive, and drifting into it at night there sometimes came a panic that I might not find my way back from wherever I'd gone. My own private vespers felt a little like counting the steps up a flight of stairs. I needed to know where I was. It was a way of bringing me home. I was a strange child.
No, it's incredibly moving, and I'm intrigued because I've interviewed writers who say often that in their childhood something happened to them. So they'd had a terrible illness and they had to go to hospital for 6 months or whatever, and that's what internalized or gave them the opportunity in some ways to examine themselves and their world and end up becoming a writer. And I'm intrigued because one of the characters in the book who you really have enormous admiration for is called Natalie Cabrol?
Natalie Cabrol, yeah.
Yes,
yeah.
And one of the things you say about her, she's an incredible astrobiologist, and you have this extraordinary adventure with her in Chile, that she didn't have any friends as a child. And I wondered whether this going back to the sort of solitude and the loss and the solitariness of life is maybe what drives these kinds of people.
I think so. I mean, I just think I have what's delightfully known now in the sort of with the kids as a spicy brain. You know, I think I'm slightly on the spectrum. I think Natalie's on the spectrum, and I think that kind of inability sometimes to take part in the kinds of school friendships that all my friends found very easy when I was a kid. I found them quite hard. You know, I'd try and impress people by telling them all the trees in the playground and then be baffled while they just stared at me, you know. So I just think, I think my brain's a little bit different from other people's maybe.
Well, lucky us.
But also, I love those moments of realization. I remember as a kid that moment of realizing that you know, there's a great, I don't know if any of you have ever gone on TikTok, but the other day I was looking at this wonderful TikTok video, which was this moment, it's a dramatization of the moment that children suddenly become aware. And it was this guy in a sort of in a schoolroom playing a kid, just going, "Where am I?" And all these other kids are like, "I'm a balloon." And he's like, "Where is this? What's going on?" I remember that moment vividly. I was at primary school. I was sitting on the rug, and I suddenly thought, "Oh, I'm going to die one day." That was good. Not in a sort of scared way. Just okay. So yeah.
So you began
Yes.
collecting eggs, which of course is not something that.
I began collecting broken eggs. I wouldn't collect real ones.
Of
live
course.
ones. Yeah.
But there was something rather interesting about that too, wasn't there? Because egg collecting was actually the height of fashion, and then suddenly it wasn't allowed. And I wonder if you just read one more little passage here.
Of course.
About the business of that.
Oh yes, egg collecting is just a really, really strange, that sort of sense that a lot of people I know of a certain age all did it when they were kids, and it really is beyond the pale now, rightly. But yes, I was always a bit scared of eggs, and they meant something I couldn't quite, there was an emotion about them I couldn't quite name. And of course, I discovered that it was all about me. Like most things about nature, it's always about human things. If you look closely in our responses, they tend to be projections. Leafing through my parents' albums, I found a photograph of me a few days after my birth, a frail and skinny thing, one arm ringed with a medical bracelet and bathed in stark electric light. I was in an incubator, for I was exceedingly premature. My twin brother did not survive his birth. And that early loss, followed by weeks of white light, lying alone on a blanket in a Perspex box, had done something wrong to me that echoed with a room full of eggs in forced air boxes, held in moist air and moved by wire. It's an incubator room for falcon eggs. Now I could put a name to the upset I felt. It was loneliness. That was when I recognized the particular power of eggs to raise questions of human hurt and harm. That was why I realized the nests in my childhood collection made me uncomfortable. They reached back to a time in my life when the world was nothing but surviving isolation. And then there was a day. One day when, quite by surprise, I discovered if I held a falcon egg close to my mouth and made soft clucking noises, the chick that was ready to hatch would call back. And there I stood in the temperature-controlled room. I spoke through the shell to something that had not yet known light or air, but would soon take in the revealed coil and furl of a west coast breeze and cloud of a hillside in one easy glide at 60 miles an hour, and spire up on sharp wings to soar high enough to see the distant, glittering Atlantic. I spoke through an egg and wept. I cry all the time when it comes to the nature. Honestly, it's ridiculous.
Yeah.
I'm constantly bursting into tears, but I'm the kind of person that if something bad happens, I don't cry at all. It's only the really soft things that absolutely make me fall apart. Yeah.
And we move on from eggs to nests.
Yes.
There's a beautiful piece you've written about the eclectic nature of what birds put together. And you almost sort of anthropomorphize these birds in some extraordinary way.
Yes, I'm always interested. I mean, I've met a couple of scientists who sort of would become obsessed on, do birds have a sense of art? And I just sort of start thinking, define your terms, And they get very interested in bowerbirds who will spend hours collecting certain kinds of blue objects and arranging them. And if you shift them out the way, the birds will put them back exactly like they wanted them. And I sort of play in the nest essay a little bit with this sense of how do birds know where things go, and how I sort of thinking about how a painter has a sort of sense when they're painting a canvas of if particularly if it's not representational, that you sort of know where things should go, and the fact that there are all these kind of inchoate kind of urges and senses and thoughts and feelings in us we don't have names for either, So I just think it's really interesting, this notion of creativity and how we think about it, and how nests in particular to me seem a really interesting way of thinking about, again, a lot of this book is about how we project our own human needs and thoughts and sort of social understandings onto the natural world. So particularly nests where birds have incorporated human things seem really odd, kind of eerie, surreal things like, nests made of, cigarette butts, or ferruginous hawks making nests of wire in cacti. They're a really interesting thing to kind of meditate on, really, in terms of where we are today.
I was snoozing in the summer, and I had my bedroom door open. I'm on the first floor, and I had a little sort of rustle on the floor, and I thought, the dogs come in. And I opened my eyes, and there was a magpie just having a look around to see what it could get for its nest just in the tree next door.
My friend Tim Dee, the astonishing nature writer, wrote a book about birds and said that, doing a tour talking about it was really difficult because all everyone wanted to know was, are magpies evil and how do you kill sparrowhawks? And he's got a bit depressing after a while.
Yeah. Yes.
But yes, it's they are very good.
They are very good.
Very
now,
good.
there was a very good little essay and very touching about swans, and this wonderful moment when you're sitting there and a swan comes over and just sits next to you, touching your thigh, and then just falls asleep.
It was absolutely bonkers. I was at Jesus Lock in Cambridge. I just had my heart broken, and I was feeling very sorry for myself. It was a very cold day, and I went and sat and stared at the river because it really matched how miserable I was feeling. And this female mute swan sort of sailed up and then got out the water, sort of hauled herself up and just sort of pattered over to me on these giant black webbed feet. And I'm like, okay, just be calm, sort of etiquette is a bit problematic here because, she's towering over me. And she just came over and she turned around and then just dumped herself down next to me with her wing pressed against my legs. And then just went to sleep with her, tucked her head into her. And I'm just thinking, God, if, this is an omen of something. I was really, really moved by it. And then I got really angry because some kids came running up and she went back in the water.
Yes. But you know how dogs, they can detect when you're miserable and they just come and lie on you or come and keep you company in the same sort of way. Can a swan? Do you think birds can have that same kind of connection with humans? I mean, going back to your hawk,
I doubt it.
Yeah.
I'd like to think so, but I doubt it. I mean, I think maybe that's one. No, I haven't got any explanations. I'd like to be. I sort of pretend I'm rational about this, but that was just very, very spooky.
Yeah.
And I really liked swans after that. I sort of loathed them before, and that's what interestingly got me into when the New York Times asked me to do a piece on Brexit because it was very topical. Not that it isn't still. I decided I was going to go swan upping on the Thames with the swan uppers. I don't know if any of you have ever seen this. It's completely ridiculous. It's this great English tradition. All the mute swans in Britain used to be owned by a whole bunch of different people. They were sort of different, and they had their little notches cut in their beaks. They were called games of swans. And in fact, way back when in medieval times, there were almost no wild mute swans at all in Britain. They were all domesticated. But all the swans in Britain now, I'm sure you know, either belong to the Crown or to two medieval guild companies, because Britain's really modern. And every year, these skiffs rowed by buff young men dressed in sort of outfits with swan feathers and braid and stuff, go up the Thames and they catch all the young swans and they mark them with their ownership marks, which are now rings. And apparently it was always a great excuse for extreme drunkenness, but they don't do that anymore. And I went with them one year on this ridiculously eccentric English. It was wonderful. And I got really, really sucked in. We went up through sort of Henley, through this extraordinary real estate with all these castles and I just thought, oh, this is wonderful. But it was a really interesting experience to watch sort of British sort of history and kind of natural history kind of coincide. And the ways in which natural and national history kind of bump up against each other and kind of mesh is really one of my other special interests. Sorry, I just got excited about swans.
No, I mean, the whole thing is sort of absolutely gripping. There's a fantastic scene you paint of being at the Empire State Building or the World Trade Center or one of those tall buildings in New York, and all the crowds with you are looking down at this, the views of the
I'm looking up.
And you're with an ornithologist,
Yeah.
and you're tracking migrating birds.
Yeah, we went bird watching at night on the Empire State Building, which I can recommend hugely in spring and fall, but no one else was doing it.
And it's flabbergasting. There are hundreds of thousands, millions of birds and insects migrating directly over Manhattan.
Yeah, there's a flyway right down the East Coast, and because most of these birds fly fairly high, you don't really get to see them from the ground. And researching this piece was a real eye-opener for me. I had I always sort of imagined the sky was kind of blank and empty, but I discovered this whole discipline called aeroecology, and spoke to a chap called Jason Chapman at Rothamsted, and talking about how he used radar to track how many insects pass over a sort of an acre of English farmland in the summer, and we've had catastrophic declines in insects, but there's still kind of I can't remember what the figure was. It was like 550 pounds of insects sort of day, just drifting over, and there's spores up there and bacteria and bats, and so I was up there, and he had his little radar on his phone, and we watched just hundreds and hundreds of birds going over, some of which got sucked into the lights and kind of circled around. They're a real problem for navigating small birds. But that's sort of
100,000 birds a year die being sucked into the lights of the...
Yes, they just get disoriented. And in fact, Jason, this chap that I was with from Cornell has this incredible job that I'm sure many of you have seen the tribute in light, the twin beams of very bright light that are shone into the sky around September the 11th to commemorate the events of 9/11. But that coincides with a huge amounts of warbler kind of migration. So what happens is these birds get sucked into the lights, or they just fly into them, and then they get disoriented, and they just spin around these columns of light. So the whole thing looks like it's full of ticker tape.
Yeah.
And his job is to sort of switch the lights off every 20 minutes so that the birds can can continue northward. Yeah, that was an extraordinary experience.
And it leads to, you talk, in a way you demystify the sky and these different layers, which of course the rest of us just never even think about. We just think of birds up there.
Yeah, no, me too. I mean, I had to, I find all this stuff out.
And this wonderful essay on swifts who fly for years.
Yeah.
They don't stop day or night. They just stay up there.
No, and I got really obsessed with them when I was a kid, because when I used to try and watch birds, I wanted to sort of see them close up and see them kind of scratch their beaks and stuff, and swifts were hopeless. I mean, you try following swifts with binoculars. And I had a really wonderful friend called Judith, who unfortunately passed away a couple of years ago, and who was a swift rehabilitator and would raise maybe 30 or 40 young swifts a year. And getting to kind of handle these creatures, which are extraordinary. When they're young, they're incredibly cuddly and squeaky, like squeaky toys, and they're constantly sort of snuggling and preening each other. And then I got to let one go. And of course, once it goes, once it leaves your hand, that bird is not going to touch anything except maybe drink water when it scoops water from the ground. It's not going to touch anything for 2 years. It's not going to land. It's going to be in the air like a fish in the sea. And that really is quite an astonishing thing to kind of think about. And these birds are...
So they're flying when they're asleep?
Yeah, they fly when they're asleep. They do the thing that all birds do, which is to sort of shut off half the brain at a time, but also they do go into kind of deep sleep up there. They'll fly in circles up there. It's quite extraordinary.
And you say the convective boundary layer, the CBL, is the humid, hazy part of the atmosphere where the ground's heating by the sun produces rising and falling convective currents, blossoming thermals of hot air. It's the zone of fair weather cumulus clouds and everyday life for swifts. Once swifts crest the top of this layer, they're exposed to a flow of wind that's unaffected by the landscape below, but is determined instead by the movements of large-scale weather systems. By flying to these heights, swifts cannot only see the distant clouds of oncoming frontal systems on the twilight horizon, but use the wind itself to assess the possible future courses of the systems. What they're doing is forecasting the weather.
Yeah, it's astonishing. The whole title of this collection, Vesper Flights, refers to these flights that swifts do every dawn and dusk. They sort of spend their days hunting in this boundary layer, but every dawn and dusk they climb up. They'll crest this layer. They may go 8,000 feet, and they do so right at the point of nautical twilight, and then they come down again. And they do this in order to forecast, the weather and work out precisely where they are. The sky at that particular point of light has very strong polarization patterns. They can see the stars and they can navigate, according to those. And I wrote this whole essay about how swifts navigate and predict the future by doing this. And it became a kind of meditation on us again, that sort of sense that, we all live our lives in this kind of thick air doing our everyday life, but if we have the time and the opportunity and the privilege to do so, we should climb higher and try and see what's coming, see what dark clouds are coming towards us. And I wrote that before the pandemic, and now when I read it, I'm like, oh my God, it really does feel like it was written about that coming on the horizon.
Yes.
Yeah.
Gosh, I hadn't thought of that. How interesting.
Yeah, it was really creepy.
Now,
yes.
Let's shift.
Yes.
Deer.
Oh. Yes, deer. There's a whole essay here about how I wasn't really interested in deer, and it was like a confession. I like birds a lot, and I like a lot of mammals, but but I was wrong. They are quite cool.
They are cool, but also it's very interesting. Just a little couple of paragraphs. I think it shows off your writing style in the most extraordinary way, because it's blending nature and mankind, as you might say, in an intriguing way. So could you just read us the beginning of Deer in the Headlights?
Yes. The scene is dusk in Epping Forest, right next to the M25.
By the way, I know that bridge, and I was brought up probably 2 miles or
Really?
a mile and a half from that exact spot.
It's very, very cool.
Isn't it?
It's very cool. I want to go back to this place. It was really intense. The deer drift in and out of the trees like breathing. They appear unexpectedly delicate and cold, as if chill air is pouring from them to the ground to pool into the mist that half obscures their legs and turning flanks. They aren't tame. I can't get closer than 100 yards before they slip into the gloom. I've been told these particular beasts are fallow deer of the menil variety, which means their usual darker tones have been leached by genetics to soft cuttlefish and ivory, and they're the descendants of a herd brought here in the 16th century as beasts of venery, creatures to be pursued and caught and cooked. The look of the estate hasn't changed much since then. It's still an extensive patchwork of pasture and forest, except now the M25 runs through it, 6 lanes of fast-moving traffic behind chain-link fence threaded with stripling trees. The mist thickens, the light falls, the deer appear and disappear, and the deep roar of the motorway burns inside my chest as I walk onto the bridge that spans it. This bridge is grassed along its length, and at dusk and dawn, I've been told, the deer use it as a thoroughfare from one side of the estate to the other. I know my presence will dissuade them from crossing, so I don't want to stay too long, but I linger a little while to watch the torrent of lights beneath me. For a while, the road doesn't seem real. Then it does, almost violently so, and at that moment, the bridge and the woods behind me do not. I can't hold both in the same world at once. Deer and forest, mist, speed, a drift of wet leaves, white noise, scrap metal trucks, a convoy of 18-wheelers, beads of water on the toes of my boots, and the scald of my hands on the cold metal rail.
Lovely, isn't it? Just
Whole
lovely.
place.
Funny enough, when I was 17, the M25 arrived, and before then, the deer just had free roam all around there. And originally, I think it was a Henry VIII.
Yes.
That was where he hunted, wasn't it? That's where he.
Yeah.
So the deer were also for hunting, or was that would have been
That was
before
a
then?
a
different
that was
species.
that herb was brought in, I think, for James I, and had been kept ever since. Yeah, they're really pale ones.
Yeah.
But yes, so many deer around there. In fact, on the way here up from where I live near Bury St Edmunds, I saw a huge herd of about 30 or 40 really dark fallow deer on a hillside, and I thought, I want to stop and watch those. And I thought, no, I've got to go to Colchester.
You've got to come to us. Yeah. Thank God.
So, but I say that because this whole essay is really about how the reason I never really wanted to know much about deer, like really obvious biological facts and about ecological facts about them, is because for me I really wanted them to be kind of these sort of animals that were kind of surprising. I wanted them to be a bit like in Celtic myth or Arthurian myth, where they'd appear and do things, or And by the end of the essay, I'm like, no, actually, it's very important to try and learn as much about animals as possible and not just imagine them as sort of, motifs about one's life. Yeah.
But, we're at Sustain.
We are.
The running theme throughout this book is that the world, I think you say the world has lost half its habitat in your own lifetime, which is a terrifying and striking thought.
Yeah, hundreds of millions of birds in Europe since I was born.
Yeah.
And it's really strange, but growing up, we talked a little bit to begin with, this sort of sense that, getting older, I just sort of unconsciously began to believe that, catastrophic biodiversity loss was as natural a part of getting old as getting wrinkles and grey hair. It's not, But that's kind of this sort of sense that that's just how it is kind of very hard to sort of kick oneself out of sometimes.
But it's interesting because you point out so many odd things that I hadn't thought about that militate against birds. So, for instance, ivy, the fashion we used to have for ivy growing up our building.
Oh my God! If you look at pictures of Cambridge University, for example, in the 1920s, pretty much every single wall of the university was ivied.
Which is a
which
perfect
would have been great
habitat
for sparrows. Food for pigeons.
Yes, and you even said that now that developers are starting to sort of net trees and hedges around developments.
Yeah.
Just to stop birds coming, making a mess.
Well, they want to take the trees down. So, and they're very worried that if they take the tree, if they net the trees in winter, then they can cut them down in the summer. And also, what's the other thing that really scares the life out of me is astroturf lawns, which are everywhere now. I don't know. I don't know. I just feel like kind of look, people, look at what's here.
Yeah. Well, landscapes they grow emptier and quieter each passing year, I think you say, and
Well, I do. I mean, the great moment of sort of horror, really, and heartbreak for that was when my little niece was very, very small. We went for a walk at Wicken Fen on a May morning, and there were drumming snipe and nightingales, and there were sort of drinker moth caterpillars. It was barn owls. I mean, it was just running with life and song. And she turned to me with a very curious look on her face and said, "Auntie Helen, when they made this place, where did they bring the animals from?" And I said, "What?" She said, "Did they come from a zoo?" And she was very serious. And that was this moment, my heart just sort of shuttered and stuttered and fell, because I realized that for her, the countryside is a very, very empty place. The fact that it was all like this, 50 years ago wasn't something she could even comprehend. So that was a rough moment. But, we're talking about all sorts of ways in which that might be ameliorated and changed. And part of this festival is, conjuring different futures. So.
Well, I have to say, you've inspired me to see so many things I didn't see in my walks. And you've encouraged me to get much closer, just reading all of this. And what I love about it is you're so self-effacing, and you're allergic to dogs.
Oh, God, all mammals, yeah.
So
terrible.
For anybody who sits there and thinks, I'm a bit urban, and, it's not for me, and all of that, this collection really opens up one's ambitions.
I once came across a very recently killed fox on a road and decided I was going to make a rug out of it, because I was that kind of person. And I was living in a rented house in Cambridge at the time, and I came back and all my housemates were out, working in accountancy firms, and I skinned this fox. And then I kind of cleansed it and flensed it, and then I washed it and put it up on the washing line to dry, and I got in massive trouble. They came in and "What are you doing?" And I was like, "There's at least 3 feet between the fox skin and your shirt, so I don't know why you're so..." And then I discovered after I cured it, and that I'm allergic to foxes. So there we go. And on that note...
Well, on that
Questions.
Questions, yes. I'm sure lots of you would like to ask a question. Over here, an old friend.
Helen, I loved it when you said you were watching a bird. You just wanted to see them scratch their beaks. And I think we all get so much joy out of just seeing the character of birds. So we can do that in many different ways. We can either sit and hide with a pair of binoculars. We can just sit around in the garden with a pair of binoculars glued to our faces. We can put a bird table up and just watch blue tits all over it all. I just find it absolutely fascinating. Or we can fly a falcon, and we can sort of do the falconry thing. Or we can keep parrots. And I think, funny enough, in my sort of early days of falconry, I got to the stage where I was uncomfortable about keeping something that was wild when it wanted to be flying and doing all the things I'd seen it be doing. Where do you stand on all those kind of things now?
Yeah.
I mean, because it's a difficult one, isn't it? Because we want to see them, but also we want to see them free.
That's a very good question. And I'm not the kind of person that says it's a very good question to try and buy time. It is a really good question. You're right. I mean, falconry now, I feel differently about it. I think I've got older. I really think it's astonishing the kinds of bonds that you can make with a wild creature like a gosse. You've flown a gosse. You really do bond with them. It's extraordinary. And they will come back to you. But, I've seen wild gosses living in the wild. I don't know. I mean, I'm not so worried about the keeping of animals, I think. If you fly them every day, and which some falconers, I guess, who are very busy don't, but that's why I don't have a hawk right now. I just don't have time to fly one every day, But I'm less hunty now. I do feel that, initially hunting with a hawk was because I wanted the hawk to be itself and do all the things, and it's very exciting hunting with a hawk. You feel you're the hawk, it's chasing a rabbit, oh my God. I don't really feel that I really want to do that anymore. I'm less hunty now, yeah. I'm less hunty. I have no problems with hunting, but I personally am less hunty now.
Yeah.
And as for birds, keeping birds, I just have, I have 2 parrots because, they're captive bred and I love them. And it's a bit of a nightmare right now because they're 2 brothers, and they're very hormonal, so they're spending a lot of time having very loud sex on top of my fridge, and then finding very small holes in my house and just spending hours incubating in there. So yeah, I have.
Do they have sibling rivalry?
No, there's just gay avian incest all day. Constantly happening. So they teach you, so much, birds. Thank you. Sorry.
Who else?
They're green-cheeked conures. So a species originally from Brazil. These were born near Mildenhall and I love them to bits, but they're nightmarish. And I need to find a new parrot sitter, so if anyone out there wants to board parrots, let me know. I should just say, sorry, I'm going to butt in, I know we're over time, but I got some stick with this book. There's a whole essay about keeping cage birds, and the whole point of this essay is to say, that there's a lot of class involved in keeping birds, and that if you're very posh and have a big lake and waterfowl, that's fine, but if you're, a working class person who keeps finches, that's kind of frowned upon. And a couple of people decided that this was a kind of, me going on about how great bird keeping is. It wasn't. I just like to point out the kind of hypocrisies that we all have when it comes to the natural world. We all, none of us, treat it objectively. It's sort of class and gender and all sorts of things are all really deeply tied up in it. Sorry, I'm eating up question time.
I like the way you deal with the movement of time in your book, in The Hawk, I think, in particular. I'm wondering about the creative process and how long it takes you actually to produce your work, and whether you go over and over and over it, and whether you know when you've finished.
That's a lovely question, too. So I think when it comes to knowing when something's finished, that's a lovely feeling. And it's the same feeling that you get when you're painting, and I always think of it as being a bit like a watch mechanism you're putting together. There comes a point when you're writing a section or a paragraph or a phrase or a longer section of the book where suddenly, no matter, you just tinker with it and then it just snaps shut and it locks you out. It works by itself. And that's one of my favorite experiences, emotional experiences of when I'm writing, is just that moment when it's like, I'm just seamless now, you can't touch me anymore. And that's how I write. So I write from the beginning to the end. I don't do bits. I always just consecutive. And then the worst thing is with the Hawk book, which is different from this because this is essays, I couldn't start writing until I'd read everything that I've written to the point where I needed to start writing again. So towards the end of writing that book, it got quite laborious. Because I needed to sort of feel the arc of where it was going. And I write word processing. I write on a MacBook, and I write with a lot of coffee inside me. And some days, you feel it's ridiculous being a writer. It's like something like, I'm a god. No one has written as well as me. Maybe Shakespeare. And then. That's nonsense. And then there are other days where you're just like, it's like wading through broken glass, and treacle. You just think, I'm never going to write another word in my life. I mean, it really is just ridiculous, a ridiculous thing to do for a living. And then in the end, you read the two kinds of writing that you've written in those two different modes, and they're both indistinguishable. So, yeah.
Who else would like to ask? Yes, this gentleman.
It wasn't a question, it was more you made me think about something. When you were talking about the Twin Towers beams and the birds getting caught,
yeah,
that's a bit like us being distracted by the semi-interesting, isn't it, of our mobile phones, rather than getting on with what's real and really getting on with life. So
yeah.
I saw it as a metaphor for us wandering into beams of nonsense.
Maybe
that's very interesting because, if you go into a pub and the telly's on, it may be silent, but your eye keeps getting caught by it. I think part of the problem with these phones is light. And I don't know if you know, but you can actually turn your phone onto black and white. And I've found that I look at my phone for about half as much time every day when it's on black and white. There's something about that brightness and colour that seems to...
Yeah. No, they are. I am a terrible addict. My mobile phone. That's it. I feel a bit panicky actually. Where is it?
It's called nomophobia.
I know. But I mean, you push the metaphor a little further. I mean, who's going to turn the lights out and let us go? I don't know. That's a really great observation. Thank you.
We've got time for one more question. Who would like to ask it?
I had a small boy once ask me what was the biggest thing your hawk ever murdered.
Oh.
Which was a slightly leading question. And I said a big rabbit, and he was so disappointed. I said, what did you think I was going to say? And he said, a horse! No, sorry. He was very disappointed in me. No more questions?
One more. Yes. Microphone, just there.
It struck me you saying quite similar things to Sophie Pavel, who was speaking yesterday. about feeling depressed about the state of the environment. And I loved your comment about hypocrisy. We're all hypocrites when it comes to the environment. So it's a bit of an unfair question, but is there anything you think people can do?
Yes, many, many things. And they can range from the very small scale, like if you have land, if you're lucky enough to have land, just, make it kind to non-human creatures. You can right up to get out there and raise voices and march. I mean, I say this with some kind of trepidation because, I was talking to you earlier about how what happened during lockdown was really weird for me. So everyone else was getting out there and discovering the natural world. And then there was this period where I just sat on my sofa and watched action movies and ate ice cream. And then I ended up writing a completely bonkers science fiction novel with a friend because suddenly it was too much for me. It was the pandemic, it was politics, it was the sixth extinction, it was climate breakdown. And I just couldn't. So I just confess that there are times when I don't feel that I feel a kind of learned helplessness. And the way that I find out of that is to think to myself that the learned helplessness is partly something that we're taught to be by the media, by corporations, it's very, very good for them for us to not do anything. So, I'm kind of revving up again now. So, raise voices. We have to do this as a collective act, no matter how much collective acts are frowned upon or people are mobilized against us, I think. And then, we have what's been happening here. There's sort of all kinds of different sort of strata and levels and parts of society can work in different ways. I'm just a writer, but landowners,
You're not just a writer, you're a literary activist. And that's very...
Thank you, William.
No, but it's very, very important.
I like to think of myself as a literary activist, that's good.
We're all here because we share something, and it's really intriguing. There are pioneer farmers, John, and talking to us yesterday and so forth, but we've also had yesterday artists who are a playwright, for instance, whose plays were on Radio 4, and that way, Archer style, changing people's thoughts.
It's got to be all. It's got to be everyone.
It all works out there in the New York Times, millions of readers, and
But I know it's really. I feel that I ought to be more polemical, though. This is something I'm not very good at. I don't like being.
Polemicists lose one. The charm of what you do is in your prose, and there's masses of poetry in your prose. One sort of gets to sort of, wallow in the wonder of it. But I've learnt so much just in reading one slim volume of your essays about the natural world. I mean,
that's really good to hear. But I mean,
it's
really easy to sort of feel that you're not doing anything so that's a lovely thing to hear. Thank you very much, William.
Not at all.
And thank you very much,
to have you.
everyone, for having me.